They stopped saying his name before they stopped burying the bodies. In the ledgers of the American South, between 1810 and 1863, there are gaps. Pages torn out, ink scrubbed until paper thinned and tore. Plantations that recorded every mule, every nail, every ounce of cotton, yet somehow forgot dozens of enslaved people at once. And in the margins of those ledgers, written faintly, always erased later, is a single phrase. Black Mamba passed through. No surname, no origin, no purchase record, only consequences. Church attendance would drop weeks after his arrival. Slave patrols would increase, but never find what they hunted. White families would lock their doors at night, not from fear of rebellion, but from something worse, recognition. Because the people who vanished after Black Mamba arrived were not the obedient, not the rebellious. They were the ones who remembered. Former slaves would later claim that Black Mamba did not run. He waited in tobacco sheds, under churches, inside orphan dormitories. And when he spoke, it was not with anger, but with precision, as if he were reminding people of something they had agreed to forget. By 1847, the phrase Black Mamba was enough to shut down entire towns. And then, without trial, without execution records, without graves, he disappeared. Or rather, he was removed. What follows is not legend. It is not folklore. It is a reconstruction, built from church confessions sealed for a century, plantation letters never mailed, and one orphanage journal found nailed shut beneath a chapel floor. This is the story America buried on purpose. The first confirmed sighting of Black Mamba appears in 1829 outside Beaufort, South Carolina. He was described as tall, quiet, and scarless, an impossible thing for an African slave of that era. No whip marks, no brand, no auction record. Witnesses said he spoke English without learning it. Not fluently, not formally, but as if he had been listening long before he arrived. Enslaved people who encountered him later testified, quietly, years after emancipation, that Black Mamba never told them to escape. He asked only one question: what did they take from you that you didn't know you had? Those who tried to answer would fall silent, not because they were afraid, because they suddenly remembered. He spoke of names before baptism, of songs sung before the crossing, of promises made not to men, but to land, ancestors, and bloodlines. And then he would leave. Days later, overseers would report madness. Enslaved men refusing orders, not violently, but calmly, as if authority no longer applied. Women staring at churches as if seeing them for the first time. Children refusing to pray. Plantation owners blamed illness. But letters recovered from Charleston archives tell a different story. They called it spiritual contamination, and they were terrified it could spread. In 1836, a Methodist church in coastal Georgia reported something unprecedented. Their basement, used to store hymnals and food donations, was locked from the inside. No one admitted entering it. When forced open 3 days later, the room was empty, except for symbols carved into the walls. Not African symbols, not Christian ones. They were maps, not of land, but of families. Names connected by lines. Marriages, forced unions, children sold away. A genealogy of theft. The pastor sealed the basement and recorded in his private journal: a Negro man without papers has shown our people their true lineage. This knowledge is not of God. It must be contained. That same night, the pastor's adopted son, himself formerly enslaved, walked into the river and never returned. By morning, the phrase Black Mamba was whispered for the first time inside a church, not as a man, but as a carrier. The most damning evidence comes from an orphanage in Louisiana, founded in 1842. Officially, it cared for unclaimed colored children. Unofficially, it was a containment site. Children brought there had one thing in common: parents who had encountered Black Mamba. The head matron wrote extensively, too extensively. She described children who refused new names, who corrected pastors on scripture, who spoke of ancestors no record showed. One child, age 7, wrote a sentence that appears again and again in confiscated documents. He told us who we were before you named us. The orphanage burned down in 1851. No investigation followed. But beneath its foundation, archivists later found a sealed box. Inside was a list titled, "Individuals Exposed to the Mamba." Every name was crossed out. At the bottom, written larger than the rest, Subject remains unaccounted for. By the 1850s, fear of Black Mamba had moved beyond plantations. It entered offices, courthouses, seminaries, places where paper decided who existed. In the National Archives, historians later uncovered a series of unsent letters, never stamped, never folded, written by local magistrates across the South. Each described the same problem using different language. An unregistered Negro influencing others without violence. A man causing refusal through remembrance. A presence undoing lawful identity. One letter, dated 1854, ends abruptly mid-sentence. If this man is not stopped, he will. The rest of the page is blank. No ink spill. No tear. As if the hand writing it simply could not continue. Witnesses from that era describe officials who met Black Mamba and then resigned days later, not in protest, but in silence. They stopped speaking publicly. Some stopped speaking at all. A clerk in Mobile was found sitting at his desk for 3 days, unmoving, staring at a birth registry. When touched, he whispered, "They named us to own us." And then he died. The state called it exhaustion. Privately, they called it exposure. In 1857, a theological seminary in Mississippi admitted a maintenance worker for 1 winter. No name recorded, but students wrote home about him. They said he never attended chapel, but listened from beneath the floorboards. They said scripture readings felt wrong when he was near, as if verses were being misquoted even when read correctly. One student journal, later hidden in a private collection, records a conversation. He asked me why Christ was allowed to suffer, but my father was not allowed to remember his mother. The student wrote that he had no answer. That night, 12 seminarians refused communion, not in rebellion, in grief. They claimed the bread felt like paper, and the wine tasted like ink. Faculty called it mass hysteria, but within weeks, sermons across the region changed tone. Less salvation, more obedience. The seminary expelled the worker without explanation. When questioned, the dean wrote, "He was not corrupting faith. He was revealing what we replaced it with." Contrary to popular myth, Black Mamba was never hunted like a fugitive. He was studied. In 1860, a covert committee, composed of plantation owners, clergy, and early psychologists, authorized what they called a containment encounter. They chose a town in Alabama already hollowed by disappearances. They invited him openly. Witnesses say Black Mamba arrived walking, unarmed, and alone. He sat in the town hall while men surrounded him with rifles that never fired. Because no one could decide why. The minutes of that meeting were partially recovered. He was asked who sent him. He answered, "No one who owns paper." He was asked what he wanted. He answered, "For people to stop confusing silence with peace." They accused him of inciting disorder. He replied, "Disorder was already here. I just named it." After 3 hours, the committee adjourned. No arrest. No charges. That night, the courthouse burned. No accelerant found. Black Mamba was gone. The Civil War erased more than lives. It erased records. And the institutions that feared Black Mamba used the chaos well. Churches burned their confessionals. Plantations destroyed private journals. Orphanages reclassified children as lost. Emancipation came, but memory did not return. Formerly enslaved people spoke of something missing. Not freedom, continuity. They remembered pain clearly, but not origin, not lineage, not names beyond grandparents. Black Mamba was no longer seen. But the damage, if that is what it was, remained. A government memo from 1867 includes a chilling line. The subject is presumed inactive. Effects persist. Recommend silence. In 1891, a northern university quietly compiled what it called the Mamba Profile. They did not describe a man. They described a phenomenon. Someone, or something, that restored suppressed identity through language alone. No violence. No threat. Just recall. The report concludes, if identity can be removed once, it can be removed again. But if restored voluntarily, it cannot be controlled. The file was sealed, and then misfiled. On purpose. The final confirmed reference to Black Mamba appears in 1912. A dying priest in Florida requested to amend a confession recorded 40 years earlier. He added one sentence. "We did not kill him. We made him unnecessary." He explained no further. When archivists searched for context, they found only one margin note beside his confession. Memory redirected successfully. By the early 1900s, Something unnatural had settled across the South. Not ignorance, not illiteracy, amnesia with structure. Freed families could trace land purchases, marriages, military service, but when asked about origin, something collapsed. Stories stopped mid-sentence. Names dissolved. Songs lost verses that were never written down. Anthropologists blamed cultural disruption. But private correspondence between church leaders used a different term: memory thinning. Children born decades after emancipation experienced it most severely. They dreamed of places they couldn't name. They reacted emotionally to symbols they'd never been taught. They felt grief with no event attached. Doctors called it hysteria. Teachers punished it. Ministers prayed it away. But in one Mississippi town, an elderly woman whispered a forbidden explanation to her grandson. Someone showed us the truth once, and they made sure it never happened again. That night, the boy carved a symbol into his bedroom wall, identical to those found decades earlier in the Georgia church basement. No one had taught him. After Black Mamba vanished, churches changed subtly. Sermons shortened. Call and response faded. Testimonies were discouraged. Not openly. Quietly. Congregants were told not to dwell on the past, not to idolize suffering, not to confuse memory with righteousness. 1904 Denominational Directive, never meant for public release, states, spiritual order requires historical restraint. In practice, this meant stories were edited before they were ever told. Older members were gently interrupted. Children were redirected. Certain questions were labeled inappropriate. Faith became clean. Too clean. A preacher in Alabama privately admitted, "We were instructed to heal people without letting them remember what wounded them." This was not mercy. It was containment. By 1918, scholars reviewing the scattered evidence reached a disturbing conclusion. There was no proof Black Mamba was a single individual. Descriptions conflicted. Ages overlapped. Sightings appeared simultaneously in different states. One researcher wrote in a suppressed paper, "Black Mamba may not have been a person, but a function, an emergence of suppressed identity under specific conditions." In other words, when memory was buried deeply enough, something rose to recover it. Not violently. Inevitably. This terrified institutions far more than rebellion ever had. You can imprison a man. You cannot arrest a recurrence. In 1923, a state orphanage in Arkansas recorded an incident eerily similar to those from 80 years earlier. A boy, no older than 9, refused his assigned name. He corrected teachers when addressed. He insisted on a name no record matched. When asked where he learned it, he answered, "He told me." There was no "he" listed in the orphanage. The boy began asking other children questions they could not answer, but could not forget. Within weeks, children reported headaches, nightmares, unexplained grief. The administration transferred the boy. The transfer destination does not exist on any map. His file ends with a stamped phrase, "Memory risk neutralized." During the Great Depression, the federal government quietly funded research into what it called cultural stability. Publicly, it was about unity. Privately, it was about suppression without force. Psychologists tested how long identity could be diluted through renaming, ritual replacement, and narrative interruption. They concluded something chilling. Trauma persists when remembered, but identity dissolves when remembered incompletely. Black Mamba had done the opposite. He restored memory whole. So the solution was not erasure, but fragmentation. Give people pieces, never the full picture. In 1939, folklorists recorded a spiritual sung by elderly congregants in rural Georgia. The melody was familiar. The lyrics were not. Midway through the song, several singers stopped simultaneously. They began to cry. One man whispered, "We're not allowed to finish that part." When pressed, they could not explain why. The recording cuts out shortly after. Later analysis revealed the unfinished verse contained a name, phonetically distorted, but unmistakable: Mamba. After World War II, references to Black Mamba vanish entirely. No whispers, no margin notes, no confessions, not because he was forgotten, but because the conditions that summoned him had been corrected. Memory was now managed before it could surface. By schools, by churches, by archives, by design. One final memo from 1948 reads, "The phenomenon requires absence to exist. We have filled the absence with structure. And yet, every generation produces a few anomalies. People who ask the wrong questions, who feel grief older than themselves, who sense that history is incomplete. They are told they are overthinking. They are told to move on. They are told the past is settled. But the past was never settled. It was sealed. And seals can break. In 1949, a closed-door gathering took place in Richmond, Virginia. There is no official record of it. No agenda. No attendance list. No minutes. But 6 men who were present would later die within a year of each other, all after amending their wills. Each amendment contained the same sentence, written in different handwriting. I consented to silence. The meeting brought together archivists, clergy, educators, and a federal psychological consultant. Their purpose was not to discuss Black Mamba as a man. They discussed him as a failure point. A moment in history where control nearly slipped, not through revolt, but through restoration. One participant reportedly said, "Chains were easier. Names were harder. Memory was the mistake." They concluded that Black Mamba did not threaten power structures. He threatened narrative ownership. And narrative, once lost, cannot be reclaimed by force. Black Mamba was never executed. He was declared obsolete. Churches were instructed to finalize standardized liturgy. Schools adopted approved history texts. Family stories were gently corrected. A symbolic funeral was held, not for a man, but for an idea. In one seminary archive, a document titled Termination of Recurrence describes the process. When identity is mediated at birth, emergence becomes unnecessary. This was the death of Black Mamba, not through violence, through replacement. In 1952, a small-town church in North Carolina renovated its sanctuary. Behind the pulpit, workers discovered a sealed envelope embedded in the wall. Inside was a single-page confession, signed by 3 former ministers. It read, "We preached obedience because truth made people ungovernable. We were afraid not of anger, but of clarity." The envelope was quietly removed. The wall resealed. The congregation was never informed. Public memory does not erase. It distorts. When whispers of Black Mamba resurfaced decades later, they were reframed. A dangerous agitator. A violent myth. A ghost story. Because if he were a healer, the system would be the wound. And that truth was unacceptable. Monsters justify containment. Teachers later warned students about subversive folklore. Psychologists labeled it collective delusion. But nowhere in official literature is Black Mamba described as violent, only as effective. One final, uncatalogued recording exists. An interview with a 96-year-old man conducted in 1954. When asked if he had ever heard of Black Mamba, the man smiled sadly. He said, "He didn't free us. He reminded us." And that scared them more than freedom ever could. The interviewer attempted to follow up. The tape ends abruptly. History teaches that slavery ended. It does not teach what followed. What followed was management. Of memory. Of grief. Of identity. Black Mamba was not erased because he was dangerous. He was erased because he proved something irreversible. That once people remember who they were before ownership, they cannot be owned the same way again. Even in 1950, decades after the termination of Black Mamba, remnants lingered. In quiet rural towns, older families spoke of ancestors who remembered too much. Children asked questions adults could not answer. Songs ended differently than in textbooks. Churches corrected stories mid-sermon. The institutions had one control, but not total compliance. Memory, it seemed, could be contained, but never fully destroyed. Black Mamba's true power was not his presence. It was the idea of recognition. Recognition that families, towns, and systems could erase lives, but they could never erase consciousness. This understanding, buried beneath decades of repression, became inherited trauma. Not taught, not spoken, but felt. Some families still hesitate before telling children certain names. Some towns maintain unspoken rules about what can be asked. Archives remain half-empty. Files remain missing. Because some truths are not safe. The rare exceptions always emerge. A child traces a family tree beyond the expected. A diary surfaces in an attic. A forgotten melody reveals lines long silenced. When these anomalies appear, adults react with fear, sometimes rage. Because history remembers differently than narrative does. And when memory returns, power shifts. Black Mamba was never about destruction. He was about restoration. If Black Mamba was a man, he is gone. If he was a role, it can be assumed, but never contained completely. Across the modern South, traces exist. Unexplained grief, songs that refuse to end, children asking questions adults cannot answer. Not myth, not magic. Memory itself, a force ungovernable. Archivists, historians, and psychologists continue to debate. Some call it folklore. Some call it psychological projection. Some, quietly, call it the return of suppressed truth. The lesson is clear, yet uncomfortable. Control systems can erase papers, burn ledgers, manipulate sermons, and fragment stories. They cannot erase what lives in consciousness. They cannot erase the truth once someone remembers. Black Mamba's final act was not visible. It was unseen, and it persists. As we close this account, remember, the story of Black Mamba is incomplete. Parts remain missing. Parts are hidden deliberately, but the fragments speak for themselves. What you have just heard is more than myth. It is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when memory is feared more than chains. And though we may never fully name him, though his ledger remains empty, his lesson persists. Truth remembered cannot be fully owned.